Okay, so you ever catch a kid just laser focused on lining up their toys, or maybe they're having a tough time getting a simple instruction,
Mm.
and you just wonder, like, what's going on in that little head of theirs? I feel like we've all been there, right?
Well, good news, folks, because you sent us some really in-depth research, and today on the deep dive, that's exactly what we're tackling. We're going deep into the world of kids and teens' minds, specifically through this super interesting lens of psychological evaluation.
You hit the nail on the head there. I mean, the stuff you sent over, Avaliação Psicológica and Avaliação de Crianças y Adolescentes, Aspectos Cognitivos, it really breaks down how psychologists actually figure out how young minds grow, how they learn, all that good stuff. And it's way more complex than just watching them play, you know what I mean? Right, exactly. So today, we're really diving deep into the nuts and bolts of this whole cognitive evaluation thing. It's all about giving you a clearer picture of like just how complex it is, but also the really cool stuff psychologists discover along the way. No surface level skimming here, folks. We're going all in on the science and the real world techniques they use.
You
Let's start with something the research really hammers home, a child's development. It's not just one thing happening. It's like a multi-layered, ever-evolving process.
It's wild when you think about how many things are developing at once. It's not just their bodies getting bigger. We're talking about cognitive abilities getting sharper, emotional maturity growing, social skills evolving. All these things are happening together the whole way through childhood and adolescence. And at the core of it all, you've got this mix of their genes and the world around them shaping everything.
And it's not like everything's perfectly synced up either,
Either.
right? Like that Johnson study from 1998, it showed the brain keeps maturing well into our 20s. It's easy to forget that different parts of the brain develop on their own timeline.
Exactly. This whole idea of asynchronous brain maturation is super important to remember. Let's say the part of the brain that controls impulses develops slower than the areas for language. That means a little kid might totally get what they shouldn't do, but their brain literally isn't wired up yet to stop them from doing it. That kind of insight totally changes how we understand their actions.
Then you add in all those daily experiences, their interactions with friends and family, cultural stuff. It's like it's all constantly shaping who they are and what they value. This back and forth between a person and their environment never stops.
Absolutely. It's this dynamic interplay. And that brings up a big question, right? How do we
Mhm.
even begin to systematically understand something that's so complex and constantly changing? It's not like taking a single picture. It's more like trying to understand a movie while it's still being edited. These sources are clear that physical development, cognitive stuff, emotional growth, social skill, it's not like they're separate boxes. They're all totally intertwined.
It's one unified process, which makes total sense. You can't really separate how a kid thinks from how they feel or how they interact with everything around them. And the research really highlights just how intense all those transformations are during childhood and adolescence. It's not just the obvious stuff like growth spurts and hormones, but all the social and emotional adjustments they're making as they figure out who they are and where they fit in.
That's exactly it. The sheer amount of change happening in those years is what we need to keep in mind. And thinking about psychological evaluation, it highlights why we need specific approaches for kids and teens, different from how we'd assess adults. Their minds and worlds are in constant motion.
So we've established that development is this huge, complex, interconnected, always-on thing. But let's zero in on the cognitive part. When psychologists talk about cognition, what are we really getting at here?
The research gives us a really helpful definition going back to Luria's work. He described cognition as higher mental functions. Basically, think of it as all the mental processes that go into how we absorb information, process it, and then actually use it. It's a broad term covering a bunch of abilities.
Like what specifically? Give us some examples.
So we're talking perception, how they experience the world through their senses. Attention, the ability to focus on what's important. Memory storing and retrieving information. Language understanding and expressing themselves. Visuoconstructive skills, things like drawing, building with blocks, doing puzzles, intellectual processes, reasoning, and problem solving. And then those crucial executive functions, the higher level stuff like planning, self-control, and flexible thinking.
So it's like the fundamental machinery is how their minds work, the link between just being alive and actively understanding and engaging with the world.
Exactly. The research really emphasizes that cognition is inseparable from being, doing, and knowing. It's the foundation of how they experience and navigate their daily lives. And it's fascinating how those cognitive abilities get more and more complex as they go from childhood to adolescence.
Yeah, that makes sense. You see, kids develop more sophisticated ways of thinking as they mature. The research mentions metacognition, that's thinking about your own thinking, and the emergence of abstract thought.
Right on. They start developing the ability to reflect on their own thought processes, to understand how they learn best, and to tackle more abstract concepts. It's not just about concrete, tangible experiences anymore. And when we think about evaluation, understanding their cognitive functioning is absolutely vital. It helps us pinpoint any difficulties they might be having, whether in school, with their behavior, or socially. And that understanding helps us develop targeted support and interventions in all sorts of settings.
Okay, so how do psychologists actually go about this whole psychological evaluation process, especially when the focus is on kids and teens? What does that process typically look like?
The research, using guidelines from the Federal Council of Psychology, defines psychological evaluation as a technical and scientific process. It's all about gathering data, analyzing it, and interpreting information about psychological characteristics. That includes cognitive functions, sure, but also emotions and personality. And they use a variety of tools and techniques to do this.
Like those psychological tests we often hear about. Are those the main things used?
Psychological tests are definitely part of the toolkit, but the evaluation process is way bigger than just giving tests. The research really stresses the ethical considerations involved, respecting the individual, staying impartial, and protecting the well-being of the child or adolescent. And something important to note is how adaptable this evaluation process is.
Adaptable in what way?
It's not a one-size-fits-all deal. The evaluation gets tailored depending on the context, like is it in a school, a hospital, for research. It also depends on the specific questions being asked, the psychological aspects being focused on, and of course, the unique characteristics of the child or adolescent being assessed. The goal is to gather enough information to make informed decisions about their development and needs.
It sounds like there's a huge need for these evaluations, especially in schools and clinical settings.
You got it. The research really emphasizes that high demand, and it's easy to see why when you think about all the reasons why an evaluation might be requested. When we connect this to the big picture, it's about understanding these young people as individuals so we can best support their growth.
So what are some common reasons why a child or a teen might go through this kind of cognitive evaluation?
The research outlines a few big ones, identifying the child's specific cognitive strengths and weaknesses. This is huge for tailoring educational approaches to how they learn best. Early detection of any learning or developmental difficulties, that allows for early intervention, which is when support is most effective. Evaluations also play a role in identifying giftedness, which might mean a kid needs special educational enrichment. And then there's differential diagnosis. That's about distinguishing between conditions that might look similar, making sure the right support is given. Plus, psychological evaluations contribute to treating neurodevelopmental disorders. They give a clearer picture of the individual's cognitive profile, which helps develop those targeted therapy strategies. At the end of the day, these evaluations give valuable information to everyone working with the child, and they help us understand their unique developmental and learning path.
You mentioned earlier that evaluating kids and teens is different from evaluating adults. What are the key differences that a psychologist needs to keep in mind when working with this age group?
The research is super clear about this. Their brains are still developing and maturing, and that's absolutely crucial. Unlike adults, whose brain development is pretty much done, kids and teens are going through these massive... What's really insightful is that developmental neuropsychology specifically looks at how the brain changes throughout childhood and adolescence, and how those changes relate to neurological, cognitive, and behavioral development. It provides a framework for understanding the unique things we need to consider when evaluating kids and teens.
Okay, so the psychologist comes in with all this knowledge about development. What about the actual evaluation session itself? What practical stuff do they need to consider to make sure the assessment is successful and informative?
The research outlines some really important practical steps, starting with careful preparation and being attentive during the sessions themselves. It points out that all sorts of things can affect a child's performance, some of them specific to this age group.
Like what? I imagine assessing a little kid can be unpredictable.
Totally. For younger kids, things like shyness, separation anxiety, crying, being tired, even needing a diaper change, can all impact their ability to engage. Physical discomfort, like teething, or even getting fixated on something in the room, can be factors. The research emphasizes being flexible when evaluating little ones.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
You can't expect a toddler to just sit still and focus for a long time.
Nope. And practically speaking, hygiene matters. Little kids explore by putting things in their mouths. Some kids might even have bad memories of medical settings. Creating a welcoming environment is key.
How do you make sure you're getting an accurate representation of their abilities, logistically?
The research stresses the importance of basic needs. Make sure the child isn't tired, hungry, thirsty, or needs the bathroom. It even suggests advising parents beforehand to make sure they've had enough sleep and a meal.
And explaining the process, especially for older kids and teens, helps to their buy-in, right?
Absolutely. If they understand why they're there and what to expect, they're more likely to engage and try their best. Communication during the session is key too. The sources recommend getting down to the child's level physically, using age-appropriate language, and giving instructions slowly and clearly. Eye contact and shared attention are also important, though that might be different for kids on the autism spectrum.
Clear communication is crucial. What about physical limitations, especially with younger kids?
That's a really important point. Fine motor skills are still developing, so using regular pencils and paper for some tasks might not be practical or give you an accurate picture of their abilities. The research suggests using things like crayons and bigger paper for little ones. And remember those attention spans we talked about. Younger kids have shorter ones, so plan for shorter sessions with breaks to keep them engaged and prevent them from getting tired.
It sounds like the examiner has to be super attuned to the child's needs throughout the entire evaluation.
Absolutely, and the examiner's own attention is crucial too. Any mistakes in how they give the tests or observe can affect the results. Since kids' attention naturally fluctuates throughout the day, it's helpful to ask parents about the best time for sessions based on the child's routine. Avoiding long or tiring sessions is also recommended, and creating a safe, comfortable, distraction-free environment is super important for a good evaluation.
Okay, so the stage is set, the child is comfy and ready to go. What's the next big step in understanding their cognitive development?
The sources emphasize the importance of the clinical interview and gathering what's called the anamnesis. The clinical interview, as Tavares describes it, is a structured investigation led by a professional who uses their psychological knowledge. The main goal is to gather a thorough history of the person being evaluated.
Why is that historical information so important for understanding their cognitive functioning right now?
It's crucial for a few reasons. It helps the psychologist plan the rest of the evaluation, choose the right assessment tools, interpret the results based on their developmental history, and ultimately come up with recommendations or interventions that fit their needs. The research emphasizes that it shouldn't just involve parents or guardians. Getting perspectives from teachers and other professionals can give a much more complete picture. It's one of the most fundamental parts of the whole evaluation process.
So what kind of information do they usually gather during that first interview with the parents? Is there a standard list of questions?
There isn't a rigid script, but the sources outline some key areas they explore to get a full picture of the child's functioning across their whole life. They gather basic info about the child and parents, the reason for the referral, and a detailed history of the issue when it started, how it's changed over time. They also get a thorough developmental history, from pregnancy and birth to major milestones like motor skills, language, and puberty. They cover medical history, illnesses, medications, hospitalizations, exams. The interview also explores personality traits, typical mood, relationships with family and peers, daily routines, and even the parents' expectations for the child. They talk about their school experience, including academic performance, concerns from teachers, and extracurricular activities. And finally, they get a preliminary overview of any cognitive, emotional, or behavioral symptoms.
Sounds like a pretty in-depth process.
Yeah.
After that interview, what happens when they start working directly with the child?
The sources highlight the importance of a free session and using playful activities, especially in the first meeting. It's a crucial chance to build trust and rapport with the child. Tavares points out that some kids might have had bad experiences with evaluations, anxieties, or even prejudice, so the psychologist needs to create a calm, safe, and encouraging atmosphere.
It's all about making them feel comfortable and supported.
Exactly. The psychologist might ask open-ended questions to understand how the child sees the reason for the referral, their worries, and their relationships with family, teachers, and friends. They also establish the psychological contract.
What does that involve?
The psychological contract is basically explaining the evaluation process to the child in a way they understand. What's the goal? What's confidential? How long will it take? And answering any questions they have. They also set ground rules for behavior during the sessions, like respecting materials. Semrid, Klickman, and Ellison suggest explaining that some tasks will be easier than others, but the important thing is to try their best, which helps them feel less pressure.
And how do playful activities fit into that initial meeting?
Using less structured, playful activities at the start lets the psychologist observe the child's natural behavior in a relaxed setting. Through play, they can see how the child handles frustration, their engagement, and how they're connecting with the examiner. Toys, puppets, Play-Doh, and drawing can all be used. Arzino talks about how this diagnostic play hour can give valuable glimpses into the child's inner world, both conscious and unconscious.
Makes sense. Play is such a natural way for kids to communicate and understand the world. So once that connection is built and they have the background information, how does the psychologist choose which assessment tools and tests to use?
Choosing those tools is a very careful process. It depends on the child's age and the specific goals of the evaluation. There are tons of resources available.
What kinds of things are we talking about besides the formal tests?
There are standardized tests, but also information from the interviews, behavioral observations, school records, and sometimes even personal documents like writing samples or artwork. Those last ones need to be used carefully, though. The main idea is to gather information from a lot of sources. The research really pushes for using multiple tools together instead of relying on just one. Kuna and the guidelines from the Federal Council of Psychology agree that a good psychological evaluation uses the right tools for the job.
When it comes to actually giving the tests, are there any strategies that work especially well with kids and teens?
Yes, the sources offer some great tips. When starting the testing, it's good to begin with tasks that feel easier and more fun for the child. This helps them get comfortable with the setting and the process. As they get used to it, you can introduce the more challenging stuff. Ending a session with an easier task where they're likely to succeed is also a good idea. It helps reduce any feelings of frustration. Positive feedback on their effort is important too. And if there will be more testing sessions, Semrid Klakeman and Ellison suggest being clear about that, something simple like, see you again next week.
Okay, the tests are done, observations made. Now comes the big part, making sense of all that data. How do psychologists go about analyzing and putting all that information together?
It's not just about looking at the numbers from the test. It's about understanding the child's overall cognitive abilities, not just their limitations. You have to consider all these factors like family dynamics, relationships, socioeconomic background, and environment.
So it's about seeing the whole child, not just a bunch of scores.
Exactly. You need both the numbers, the scores, and comparisons to other kids their age, and the qualitative data, what you observe during the sessions, how they approach the tasks, their engagement. Lezak, Howison, and Loring emphasize that understanding why a child made a mistake is more important than just noting the mistake itself.
I can see that. You learn a lot from how they approach a problem, even if they don't get it right.
Exactly. Combining all this information into a clear picture can be tough, especially for newer clinicians. But training, mentorship, and supervision can be really helpful in developing those interpretation skills.
So after all that data is collected, analyzed, and put together, how do psychologists share those insights with the parents?
The feedback interview is the final crucial stage. It's where they present the findings, often in a formal report, and discuss them with the parents, and often the school, too. It's not just about giving them the results, it's a conversation about what it all means and what interventions or support might be helpful. They also answer any questions the parents have.
It's more of a collaborative discussion.
Definitely. The psychologist explains the main findings, sometimes with numbers, sometimes focusing on descriptions, and uses real-life examples the parents can relate to. They present the child's strengths and weaknesses in a balanced way. Most importantly, they give practical advice and recommendations tailored to the child's needs and the family's situation. The sources remind us that the formal report is an official document with specific language, following ethical guidelines. But they make sure to explain everything clearly to the parents so they're comfortable asking questions. It's also important to remember that evaluations are a snapshot in time. Development is ongoing, as Machado and Morona point out, so new evaluations might be needed later on.
The source material also has a helpful list of 10 recommendations for a good psychological evaluation. Can you touch on those main principles?
Absolutely. It covers some fundamentals. Building a strong rapport with the child and family, working closely with parents and professionals, checking for sensory issues that might affect the evaluation, doing a thorough interview, timing the sessions well, using age-appropriate and reliable assessment tools, using multiple techniques for a complete picture, analyzing data both numerically and through observation, giving feedback clearly and respectfully, and above all, being empathetic and respectful throughout the entire process.
Those are all so important for making sure the evaluation is thorough, informative, ethical, and supportive for the child and family.
Yeah.
Now let's focus on the cognitive aspects of these evaluations. What are the main areas psychologists are looking at when they're evaluating a child's or teen's cognition?
The sources reiterate that cognitive functioning is a central focus when evaluating children and adolescents. No matter the age, a complete cognitive assessment needs to address the core abilities involved in how they learn, process, and use knowledge. These include attention, learning and memory, language, visual, spatial, and motor coordination skills, executive functions, and intellectual processes or general intelligence.
And the research mentions neuropsychological assessment with a focus on cognitive functions. What extra insights can that provide?
When combined with other information, a neuropsychological assessment focused on cognitive functions can shed light on a child's learning processes and any difficulties they might have. It helps pinpoint strengths and weaknesses, understand the extent of any impairments, and recognize any behavioral or social emotional issues that might be linked to underlying cognitive issues, as Miranda, Borges, and Rucka explain.
It's about connecting how the brain works with the child's observable abilities and behaviors. So how do psychologists decide which tools and techniques to use for assessing these different areas of cognition?
Choosing the right tools is strategic. It depends on what the examiner needs to learn and what will be most beneficial for the child and their family. Factors include what specific questions need to be answered, practical limits like time, the setting of the evaluation, and the child's unique characteristics, their age, education, and challenges or strengths. The sources emphasize that the examiner needs to have clear ideas about the child's cognitive functioning before choosing specific methods.
What are some of the main types of techniques and instruments they use in cognitive evaluations?
The sources highlight three main categories: psychological tests, behavioral observations, and ecological tasks. Psychological tests are standardized instruments designed to measure specific psychological traits, including cognitive abilities. It's super important that these tests are valid, they measure what they're supposed to, and reliable, they give consistent results, and that they have clear guidelines for administration and interpretation. The sources point out that in Brazil, there aren't many well-validated cognitive tests specifically designed for kids and teens, which is something professionals need to be aware of. Behavioral observations involve systematically watching and recording specific behaviors, noting how often they happen, how long they last, and the context. This gives valuable information about how the child functions in real situations, adding to the data from the more structured tests. Ecological tasks are more informal activities relevant to the child's everyday life. Things like asking them to draw, copy a design, describe events, or recall details from a story. The psychologist's expertise is key in designing and interpreting these tasks.
Let's break down some of those specific cognitive domains. When a psychologist is evaluating attention, what are they looking for, and what kinds of tools do they use?
The sources describe attention as this multifaceted ability that's always monitoring the environment and giving us the focus we need for everything else to work right. They divide attention into a few key parts: alertness, being awake and responsive; selective attention, focusing on what's important and ignoring distractions; alternating attention, shifting between tasks or stimuli; divided attention, paying attention to multiple things at once; and sustained attention, staying focused on one thing for a while.
What are some examples of the tests they might use to assess those different parts of attention?
For selective attention, there's the Selective Attention Test, or TAS, and various cancellation tasks, as well as some parts of the WISC-EV intelligence scale. The Psychological Battery for Attention Assessment, or BPA, is used for sustained, divided, and alternating attention. Other aspects, like concentration, inhibiting impulses, and processing speed, can be assessed with the Concentrated Attention Test, D2, the 5-digit test, FDT, go-no-go tasks, and the Stroop test. And don't forget, just observing the child, like, do they make eye contact? Are they easily distracted? Can tell you a lot about their attention.
What about learning and memory? How do psychologists evaluate those in young people?
Memory is a basic cognitive process that underlies all learning. It involves different systems, mainly short-term or working memory and long-term memory. Short-term memory and working memory are about holding and working with information you need for a task. They can be assessed with tasks like digit span, repeating numbers, letter number sequencing, and the Corsi blocks test, remembering spatial locations. Long-term memory is about storing information more permanently. You can evaluate that with the Ray complex figure, remembering a visual design, verbal fluency tasks, generating words in a category, and tests like the Ray Auditory Verbal Learning Test, RAVLT, which is about learning and recalling lists of words. If a child keeps asking the same questions or has trouble getting back into a task because they forgot the instructions, that can also be a sign about their memory.
Let's move on to language, obviously a huge part of cognitive development. What are the key aspects they assess, and what tools do they use?
Language is all about expressing yourself and understanding others through signs and symbols. They often break it down into phonological awareness, recognizing and working with sounds, semantic knowledge, vocabulary and word meanings, morphosyntactic skills, grammar and sentence structure, and pragmatic abilities, using language socially. They might use tests like the Convias for phonological awareness, vocabulary subtests from intelligence scales like the WISCV, and measures of reading and writing skills like the TDE and PROLEC. But besides formal tests, just paying attention to how a child speaks and writes can give you valuable information. Like, are they consistently leaving out letters or having trouble naming things?
What about things like drawing, building with blocks, or doing puzzles? How do they evaluate those from a cognitive perspective?
Those fall under visuo-constructive skills, which involve creating or building things, combining motor skills with visual spatial awareness and organization. Drawing, especially, can be powerful for kids to express themselves visually, and it can reflect cognitive and emotional development. They might use copying tasks like reproducing the Ray complex figure or the Bender-Gestalt test designs, and block design tasks where the child has to match a pattern. Observing their fine and gross motor skills, their spatial reasoning, and how they organize their approach to the tasks also gives important information.
And what about those higher level skills, the executive functions like planning, problem solving, and impulse control? How do they assess those?
Executive functions are all about goal-directed behavior. They include things like inhibitory control, resisting impulses, working memory, mental flexibility, switching between tasks or rules, organizational skills, and planning. Tests like the 5-digit test, FDT, and the Stroop test assess inhibitory control. Organization and planning can be examined with the Ray complex figure, block design tasks, and problem-solving tasks like the Towers of Hanoi. Mental flexibility can be evaluated with the Wisconsin Card Sorting Test, WCST, and the Trail-making test. Beyond tests, you can observe the child's behavior. Are they impulsive? Do they have trouble organizing their things? Do they struggle with changes in routine?
Lastly, let's talk about evaluating overall intelligence. How do they assess that broader cognitive ability in kids and teens?
The idea of intelligence has changed over time, but it generally refers to the ability to think rationally, solve problems, and learn from new experiences. Modern theories, like the Cattle-Horn-Carroll CHC model, say intelligence includes fluid intelligence, solving new problems, and crystallized intelligence, knowledge and skills from experience and education. They might use nonverbal intelligence tests like the SONAR-R and the TONE-I3, which don't rely as much on language, or full intelligence batteries like the WISC-4 and the WISI, as well as neuropsychological batteries like the NUPSILIN. You can also learn from observing a child's problem-solving strategies, their curiosity, and their confidence when facing challenges.
It's amazing to see all the tools and approaches psychologists use to understand these different yet connected parts of cognitive development. Before we wrap up, the research you share touches on some key factors that can really impact a child's cognitive development. What are some of the main things at play here?
The research highlights a whole web of factors. Biological factors, especially the ongoing maturation of the brain, are fundamental, of course. Hereditary factors, meaning the genes a child inherits from their parents, also play a big role. But it's not just nature. Nurture is hugely important, too.
So it's that classic nature versus nurture debate.
Right, but it's not really about one being more important than the other. It's more about how they interact. The socioeconomic environment the child grows up in, the quality of their family life, and their access to resources all have a massive impact. Social interactions, the relationships with family, friends, and other adults are incredibly influential too. Think about it. Those early interactions shape how they see themselves, how they learn to relate to others, and how they develop language and social skills. And then there are all those individual life experiences, everything from daily routines to major life events. Education, both access to it and the quality of that education, is also a major factor. Cultural aspects, the values and beliefs of their community, all play a role too. And we can't forget about emotional factors. A child's emotional well-being, their sense of security, their ability to regulate their emotions, these all affect their cognitive development as well.
It's like all these pieces of the puzzle fitting together to shape how a child's mind develops. It's incredibly complex, but also fascinating to see how these different influences interact.
I agree. It's a reminder that we need to look at the whole child and their whole world to truly understand their cognitive journey.
Well, there you have it, folks. A deep dive into the fascinating world of psychological evaluation and cognitive development in children and adolescents. We've explored the core principles, the stages involved, the ethical considerations, the tools and techniques, and even the factors that shape this complex journey. Hopefully, this gives you a new appreciation for the intricate workings of young minds and the dedicated work psychologists do to understand and support them.
Absolutely. By understanding how psychologists approach this complex process, you can better appreciate the nuances of how those little brains work.
Now, here's a question to ponder as we wrap things up. Considering all the things that influence a child's cognitive development, what do you think is the most crucial element in helping them reach their full potential? It's a complex question with no easy answers, but it's worth thinking about. Keep in mind, this is a journey, not a destination, and our understanding of cognitive development is always evolving. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Until next time.